review the WJ4 ECAD test. Test 1 is memory for names. This is associated with the broad ability of long-term retrieval and the narrow ability of associative memory. This is a controlled learning task. It's learning and recalling names. It's the ability to remember previously unrelated information and having it been paired. It also only requires a motoric response. That means that the student is only going to be pointing during this task. In this slide, you'll see a direction that would be given to the student during the administration of this test. I'm going to show you a space creature and tell you its name. Then I will show you a page with more space creatures and ask you to point to the one I name. Remember to point every time I tell you a name. Looking at this page, you see that little space alien creature, and this is really a test that engages the student pretty quickly with test 1. You're going to tell the student to look at Joss and then point to Joss, and that's all you're asking to them. An example of what you're asking them to do with this is on this page. Now you're going to be presenting them a page of all different space alien creatures and asking them to now point to Joss. The test builds. As the test goes on, you're introducing more characters and you're asking them to point again to those characters as that information builds cumulatively. Sound blending is test 2. This is something that we have on our oral language battery as well with the WJ4. This is the CHC broad ability of auditory processing. It's the ability to blend phonemes and syllables together. And in this test, an oral response is required. These are some of the directions that you'll see as part of the sample items. I'm going to say a word one part at a time. Then you tell me the word I said. For example, if I say dad, you would say daddy. Now notice how in the sample item I'm actually speaking. However, as the test progresses and you get to further items, you'll then be using an audio recording. The audio recording can always be found in the resource tab of your Riverside Score account for all of your WJ4 batteries. Here are some of those items that you would see. This is what you see on your side of the easel. The student has nothing on their side. Again, auditorily, they're listening to this information from the recording and blending those sounds to put them together to make the word. Test 3 is picture vocabulary. The CHC broad ability that this is associated with is comprehension knowledge. It's the ability to identify pictured objects. It's word knowledge and correct word meanings. And in this test, an oral response is required. However, they do have those visual cues of those bright colored pictures. This is a picture of a car. Point to the car. The student then points to the car and you say car. All you're asking them to do in the sample item is just to point and then to repeat the word. The test goes on and it starts with some easier items, knowing that this test is designed for a child as young as 2 years, 6 months, and they do progress to get more difficult. Test 4 is verbal analogies. The CHC broad ability, where this test is most closely related, is in fluid reasoning, that's GF, or comprehension knowledge, GC, a blend of the two. As it is, we know verbal analogies probably from our own history. This is the ability to comprehend and complete logical word relationships. It uses inductive reasoning to map the structure of the first part of the analogy to the second. And it really is looking at the underlying characteristics. What's the rule, the concept, the process that governs a problem or set of materials? This test requires a verbal response. Finish what I say. A bird flies, a fish. The easel gives you some options to choose from. These would be swims and swim. Finish what I say. Mother is to father, as sister is to. The child then completes that answer as well. Test 5 is visual closure. We're still working on those first 7 tests that all load into that E developmental GIA. The CHC broad ability, where this really measures, is visual spatial thinking. It's the ability to identify a drawing that has been altered or distorted. This test requires a verbal response. This is an example of what the student would see on the easel. And what you would say is, what picture is this? The child can provide the answer to be an airplane or a plane and get that 1 point for credit. Test 6 is sentence repetition. The CHC broad ability that we're looking at within this area is short-term working memory. And also, if you think about narrow abilities, the auditory memory span. It's the ability to remember and repeat single words, phrases, and sentences from an audio recording. An oral response is required. In this test, this is where we start with very short phrases for the student, knowing that, again, we're starting with a student that's very young, 2 years, 6 months. The first one would be hot food. All you are asking of the student is to repeat what you said. They need to repeat all the words to get credit. There is no partial credit that's given on this test. Test 7, and our last test that goes into that E-developmental GIA, is rapid picture naming. This looks at that broad ability of long-term retrieval, as well as the neuro ability of speed of lexical access. Those of you who are familiar with our WJ4 oral language battery, this test is also there as well. However, remember what I said, this is an alternate form of that test. This would be the ability to quickly recall the names of simple pictures. This is looking again at the speed of lexical retrieval. How quickly can you pick that information, that verbal information from your memory? And then another one is looking at how this is related to reading. If you think about how we read, we're looking at symbols, which are letters. We're putting them together and we're reading them. This is kind of similar. You're having to follow along and read off all of those different pictures instead of letters, but it's giving you that flow of information. This is a 2-minute time test. So it would be really great to have your Apple phone, your device in front of you, a stopwatch, something to keep track of time. Because when that 2 minutes is up, that is when you need to stop the student from continuing their work. Let's take a look at what this test looks like by looking at the sample items. Look at these pictures. Tell me the names of these pictures as fast as you can. When you finish the first row, start with the next row right away. Go ahead. This is your sample item for the student. What you need them to do is exactly what the directions say. Now, you might have some students who are looking at you and don't know where to start, and you could definitely cue them where to start. However, this is your sample area, so you want them to become very comfortable, because the next part of this will be the very same pictures. However, they'll be on their own. They'll be given that 2-minute time period to name as many as possible. So it's really important that the student feels comfortable, that we scaffold them with the learning within the sample items like we would do with any test. This is a really great, really engaging test for a lot of students because of the pictures and because it's a fun little game for them. Now we're going to cover the 3 academic tests. The first one is letter word identification. Those of you who are familiar with the WJ4 test of achievement, that's test number 1. It's one of our hallmark tests within the achievement battery. It's really looking at the ability to read and write. We want to look not only at letters, but we want to see how quickly or how well a student could go and read a word, how fluently they could read that word. This is a little different, and what I mean is we've scaled it back a little bit. Remember from our very first revision goals of the ECAD, we wanted to provide some more basal level items, and this is where this really comes into play, is with this achievement test. It's looking at the ability to recognize letters and read words correctly, but guess what? They don't start reading words until number 24, item 24. There's print awareness, letter word identification skills, but there's better item density than the WJ4 achievement for a young child. If I were looking at the test side by side, I would see that there's 8 print awareness items in the WJ ECAD versus 1 on the WJ4 test of achievement. There's also 8 letter recall items on the WJ ECAD versus 3 on the WJ4 test of achievement. I say this because I want you to think about the student you're assessing. If it's a young student and you want some more items to give them, the WJ ECAD might be a better place to start your assessment with that student. Here's an example of some of the very early items. Now remember, we're not getting into word reading until item 24. So you're going to see a lot of items like this, asking the student to find the P down below. So really just pointing. We're going to ask them to go and find the letter on a page. Very much, this is item number 6. We're not asking them to read a word at this point. And items like this, like item number 10, we're asking the student to look at the picture of all the letters on their page and point to the O. So again, we're still not asking them to read a word. We're really finding out, do they have those basic building blocks of reading, those pre-academic skills that are going to make them successful in the classroom. Number sense is test number 9. This is looking at quantitative knowledge. It's counting, it's problem solving, mathematical knowledge, and basic computation. Overall, there's a better scaling of items. You're not going to jump into telling time by item number 3. You're really going to stay with the student where they are developmentally and educationally. It's very important, and I could tell you from firsthand experience, by starting lower, giving students more of those basal level items, you're keeping them engaged longer. And that's really important when we're assessing the young students. Let's take a look at one of the items. The very first items are those famous ones that we have from our WJ for achievement. Show me your hand, show me your fingers, show me just one finger, and show me 2 hands. It's a fun little activity too for the kids to do, to kind of feel like they're engaged, physically in the assessment as well as intellectually. These are some examples of items. Now, these would be on different pages in the easel, allowing the student just to focus on one item at a time. The top one that has the 2 houses asks, how many houses are there? The item on the bottom says, point to the largest star, and you pause for the child to respond, and then you say, now point to the smallest star. These would be the last 2 items in the test, number 24 and 25. I show this because I want you to get an idea of the scaling of items. We start with, again, those hands, the fingers, we go into pictures, and then we really get into more complex mathematical computation questions. So the one up top is 5 times blank equals 2 times 5. What number belongs inside the square? And the last item is listen. About how many weeks are 15 days? The last test on the WJ4 ECAD is writing. This requires a single-page student response booklet where the child will draw lines, trace letters. They'll also produce upper and lowercase letters, which will be items 9 through 16. And then they'll finally start to spell single-word responses on item 17. This is going to look a lot like spelling on the WJ4 achievement, except it's going to take time to scale up in those items. We're not going to have the student trace a couple items and then jump into write these words. It's really going to take a little bit more time to get there. Now note, this has nothing to do with what our writing samples have, because again, this is a more developmentally, educationally appropriate test for those young learners. Here are some items that might look familiar from the spelling subtest on the WJ4 achievement. And for those of you new to our WJ achievement family, as well as the ECAD family, this is where you would ask the student to watch you, and you would make a scribble down the left side of the box. Then you would ask the student, now you scribble like I did right here. That's all they need to do. The next item is you hand the pencil to the child, you point to the S and say, now you make one just like this. Make it here. These are an example of some of the items once the student starts getting into the section of writing actual words. Some of them might be he, in, fun, always providing them with the number of the item, a little bit more context with a sentence, and repeating that item a couple times just to make sure that they hear it. So number 17 is spell the word he is happy, he.